Hollywood loved Montgomery Clift for his quiet intensity, but he hated the way Hollywood worked. For 12 years, Clift turned down every film offer. Yes, even the big ones. He refused to play by their rules, choosing to stay on Broadway and perfect his craft. When he finally said yes to Hollywood, he did it on his terms. What drove this rebel actor to reject fame and fortune at its peak? The truth is even darker than you think. Montgomery Clift was born on October 17, 1920, in Omaha, Nebraska. His family was rich, living a life that most people could only dream of. His father, William Brooks Clift, was a powerful banker and a vice president of a big company. Montgomery and his siblings didn't go to normal schools. Instead, they had private tutors who traveled with them. The tutors focused on things like literature, music, and art, which Montgomery loved. Without strict school schedules, he had plenty of time to dive into the things that excited him. This freedom let him discover his creative side early on, even though he had no idea it would one day lead to acting. But everything changed when the Great Depression hit. In 1929, the stock market crashed, and the Clift family lost nearly all their money. Their fancy lifestyle came to an abrupt end. By 1933, when Montgomery was 13, the family had to move to a small house in Sarasota, Florida. Life was much simpler and harder now. This drastic change left a big impact on Montgomery, forcing him to adapt and find new ways to express himself. It was in Sarasota that Montgomery discovered acting. He joined a local youth theater group, mostly as a way to pass the time. But what started as a casual activity quickly became his passion. For the first time, he felt like he had found something he truly loved. Less than a year later, Clift's family moved again, this time to New York City. This change proved transformative for his budding career. At just 14, Montgomery stepped onto a Broadway stage for the first time. It was January 15, 1935, and the play was called Fly Away Home. It ran for over 200 performances, and Montgomery's performance as Harmer Masters stood out. Critics couldn't believe how poised and natural he was at such a young age. One review even called his work amazing. The producer of the play, Theron Bamberger, praised his instincts, saying Montgomery had a rare, natural talent that couldn't be taught. By the time he was 17, Montgomery was already a star on Broadway. He began taking on bigger roles, like the lead in Dame Nature, proving he was more than just a child actor. Over the next few years, he performed in at least 10 different Broadway productions. Some of these plays, like Our Town and The Skin of Our Teeth, became legendary, and Montgomery's performances made him one of the most talked-about young actors of his time. He wasn't just playing roles, he was mastering his craft, diving deep into every character and showing his ability to bring complex emotions to life. During these years, Montgomery worked with some of the biggest names in theater. He performed in plays written by Moss Hart, Tennessee Williams, Lillian Hellman, and Thornton Wilder. These collaborations pushed him to grow as an actor. One of his most important roles came in 1942 when he worked on Thornton Wilder's The Skin of Our Teeth. The play was a huge success, winning the Pulitzer Prize, and Montgomery's role in the original production cemented his reputation as one of the best young actors on Broadway. What made Montgomery truly special was his unique style of acting. Most actors back then performed in a loud, dramatic way that fit the theater's grand stages. But Montgomery was different. He acted with quiet intensity. He used small pauses, subtle movements, and a calm voice to draw people in. He didn't rely on flashy gestures or over-the-top delivery. Instead, he made every moment feel real. This natural, understated style was ahead of its time and set him apart from other actors. But there is another shocking aspect. For 12 years, starting in 1934, he turned down every chance to work in Hollywood. While most actors would jump at the opportunity, Clift wanted to stay on Broadway and perfect his acting skills. He starred in famous plays like Our Town and The Skin of Our Teeth. During this time, he even refused roles in movies that later became legendary, like Sunset Boulevard and On the Waterfront. His choice wasn't about being stubborn, it was smart. By the time he was ready for films, studios were desperate to work with him. Clift's patience made him one of the most exciting actors in the business before he even stepped in front of a camera. In 1946, Clift finally said yes to a movie. He chose Red River, a Western starring John Wayne. It wasn't an easy decision, but the script caught his attention. Clift's acting style was quiet and emotional, the opposite of Wayne's tough, old-school approach. Watching them together on screen was fascinating. Filming wasn't easy for Clift. He had to learn how to ride horses and shoot guns convincingly, but he nailed it. His performance impressed everyone. Even the famous director John Ford, after seeing Red River, joked about Wayne, saying, "I didn't know the big guy could act." After the success of Red River and another hit, The Search, Clift quickly became a star, but he didn't let Hollywood control him. In 1948, he signed a deal with Paramount, but it was on his terms. The contract let him quit at any time, something no other actor had at the time. He also got first pick of the best scripts. Most actors would have taken anything offered, but Clift stayed picky. He even said no to Sunset Boulevard twice because it didn't feel right for him. He didn't want to just be in movies. He wanted to make sure every role mattered. Clift wasn't like other stars of his time. Back then, studios controlled everything about their actors, from what movies they did to how they looked. Clift refused to play by those rules. He never signed a long-term contract with any studio, so no one could tell him what to do. On set, he was just as bold. He insisted on changing dialogue if it didn't feel natural, and even brought his own acting coach to help him. This level of control was unheard of in Hollywood, but Clift didn't care. He wanted to do things his way. People called it the start of actor power. Other actors, like Marlon Brando and James Dean, followed in his footsteps, refusing to let studios dictate their careers. By 1948, just 2 years after his first movie, he was already on the cover of Life magazine. Clift is often called a method actor, but he didn't follow the usual method acting teachers like Lee Strasberg. In fact, he didn't like Strasberg's way of teaching. Instead, he learned from Robert Lewis, who taught actors to focus on the character and the story, not their own emotions. This suited Clift's style. He believed acting should come from the script and the situation, not from digging into personal feelings. Clift also had a mentor named Alfred Lunt, a famous stage actor. Lunt taught him to pay attention to small details. Clift said Lunt's acting was like reading a great book, full of little things that made it special. In 1951, Montgomery Clift starred in A Place in the Sun, a movie that became one of the biggest highlights of his career. He played George Eastman, a man caught in a heartbreaking situation. The movie paired him with Elizabeth Taylor, and their chemistry was incredible at playing complex, deeply human characters. 2 years later, in 1953, Clift reached even greater heights with From Here to Eternity. He played Private Robert E. Lee Prewitt, a soldier who refuses to box, even though it could cost him everything. The movie was a huge success, earning over $30 million, which would be like $300 million today, and winning 8 Oscars. One of the most famous scenes shows Clift playing taps on the bugle. It lasts less than a minute, but it's unforgettable. What's amazing is that Clift spent 3 months learning to play the bugle just for that short moment. People watching the movie thought he was a real musician. It was that convincing. His performance earned him another Oscar nomination, proving again that he was one of the best actors in Hollywood. Between 1949 and 1954, Clift was nominated for 4 Oscars. He got his first for The Search, followed by A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and later Judgment at Nuremberg. He never won, but the nominations alone showed how incredible he was. He even made history as the first actor to get a posthumous Oscar nomination for his role in Judgment at Nuremberg after his death in 1966. Clift was known for how hard he worked on his roles. For From Here to Eternity, he read the book 15 times and spent weeks studying real soldiers to make sure everything he did felt real. What made Clift stand out was how different he was from the typical male stars of his time. Back then, actors like John Wayne played tough, rugged heroes who rarely showed emotion. Clift's characters, on the other hand, were vulnerable, complicated, and relatable. In Red River, he acted alongside Wayne and still managed to hold his own, even though he was much younger and less experienced. That movie also had subtle hints of attraction between his character and John Ireland's, which was very bold for the time. In A Place in the Sun, Clift played a man torn between love, guilt, and ambition, far from the straightforward heroes audiences were used to. His role as Private Prewitt in From Here to Eternity showed a soldier with principles, someone who wouldn't give in no matter what. Off-screen, Clift's personal life also broke the mold. He was bisexual, which was an open secret in Hollywood, and it gave him a unique perspective that he brought into his characters. Clift didn't just change how people thought about masculinity, he changed Hollywood itself. He paved the way for actors like Marlon Brando and James Dean, who followed his lead in showing vulnerability and emotional depth. He prepared for every role with incredible detail. For The Heiress, he spent months learning how people from the 19th century behaved. He was also known for rewriting his lines to make them simpler but more powerful. In From Here to Eternity, he changed a line from "and then I hit him, and he went blind" to "and then I hit him, and he couldn't see anymore," believing it sounded more natural and real. On the night of May 12, 1956, Montgomery Clift's life took a devastating turn. He had been at a dinner party at Elizabeth Taylor's house in Beverly Hills, celebrating their work on the movie Raintree County. At about 12:30 a.m., Clift got into his car, a 1955 Chevrolet convertible, and started driving home. The road he took, known as Sunset Mountain, was narrow and filled with sharp curves. On top of that, the night was foggy, making it hard to see. As he approached a tight bend, Clift lost control of the car. It smashed into a telephone pole so hard that it knocked a massive transformer off the pole, barely missing his vehicle. The crash left Clift trapped in a wreck that Elizabeth Taylor later described as crushed like an accordion. The car's engine was pushed into the front seat, pinning him under the dashboard. His face hit the steering wheel with incredible force, leaving him with terrible injuries. His jaw was broken in 2 places, his nose was smashed, and a deep cut ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth. Many of his teeth were knocked out, and some were stuck in his throat, blocking his airway. The left side of his face was severely damaged, leaving it partially paralyzed. Clift was barely conscious and struggling to breathe. Elizabeth Taylor became the hero of that night. A friend who had been driving behind Clift rushed to Taylor's house to tell her what had happened. She immediately ran to the scene, finding the car doors jammed shut. Without hesitating, she climbed through the back window, cutting her hands and knees on the broken glass. Inside the car, she found Clift choking. Acting quickly, she used her fingers to pull broken teeth out of his throat, saving his life. She then cradled his head in her lap, talking to him softly to keep him awake until help arrived. When photographers started showing up, she fiercely protected Clift's privacy, threatening never to pose for a photo again if they dared take a picture of his injured face. Her boldness worked, and no photos were taken that night. Clift spent the next few months undergoing painful reconstructive surgery. Doctors used wires, plates, and skin grafts to rebuild his face. Even though they worked hard to repair the damage, his face was never the same. The left side remained partially frozen, his nose looked different, and his mouth had a slight twist. His voice also changed, becoming softer and less clear. When he returned to finish filming Raintree County, the differences were noticeable. The director had to use clever lighting and camera tricks to hide the changes in his appearance. However, the accident took a heavy toll on his personal life. The constant pain from his injuries led him to rely on strong painkillers, which eventually turned into an addiction. He also drank heavily, using alcohol to cope with both the physical pain and the emotional trauma of the crash. On film sets, his behavior became unpredictable. He often showed up late, forgot his lines, and struggled to work. His addiction grew worse, and his career began to decline. In 1961, Montgomery Clift starred in The Misfits, a movie directed by John Huston. It also starred Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable, and became famous for its troubled production. It was Monroe's last completed film, and Gable passed away soon after filming ended. Montgomery Clift's life took a sad turn in his final years. His health started failing badly in the 1960s after years of heavy drinking and drug use. The car accident he had in 1956 only made things worse. By 41, Clift didn't look like himself anymore. His green eyes, once bright and striking, were now swollen and clouded due to a thyroid problem and cataracts. He had terrible stomach pain from colitis, a condition he had since catching dysentery in Mexico Mexico years earlier. To deal with the pain, he took more and more pills. Clift also drank heavily, and he started mixing alcohol with his medication. This combination made his health spiral even further. When he worked on The Misfits in 1961, Marilyn Monroe, who was also struggling with her own problems, said, "He's the only person I know who's in worse shape than I am." By 1964, he was so unwell that movie studios wouldn't hire him because they couldn't insure him. His handsome face was now swollen, and his hands shook so much that even small tasks became hard. His acting teacher, Robert Lewis, called it the longest suicide in Hollywood history. Even though his body was breaking down, Clift didn't stop acting. He gave one of his best performances in Judgment at Nuremberg in 1961. He played a man sterilized by the Nazis, and his scene was incredibly moving. It was so real that some people thought he was having an actual breakdown on camera. Because he was having trouble remembering lines, the director let him improvise. This gave his performance even more raw emotion, earning him his 4th Oscar nomination. Clift's final movie was The Defector in 1966, a Cold War spy story. By then, he looked frail and tired, but he pushed through and finished the film. It showed just how determined he was, even as his health kept getting worse. He tried to get better in the early 1960s. In 1962, he stayed at a clinic in New York, hoping to quit drinking and using pills. It worked for a short time, but he soon went back to his old habits. His friend Elizabeth Taylor, who had saved his life after his car crash, stood by him. In 1965, she even paid for him to be insured for a role in her movie Reflections in a Golden Eye. She believed in him, but his addictions made it hard for him to keep working. In his last years, Clift stayed mostly at home. He moved into a townhouse in New York City after a fire destroyed his old house. He painted the outside bright orange, which annoyed his neighbors, but the house became his safe place. He rarely went outside and spent his time reading, listening to music, or seeing a few close friends. His secretary and companion, Lorenzo James, stayed with him and became one of the few people he trusted. On July the 23rd, 1966, Clift's life ended suddenly. Lorenzo found him dead in his bedroom. The cause was heart disease, and he was only 45. His last words were about The Misfits, which was airing on TV that night. A strange coincidence, since it had been one of his final major roles. Marilyn Monroe, his co-star in that film, had also died young just a few years earlier. Clift's death shocked Hollywood. Elizabeth Taylor and other friends attended his funeral, mourning the loss of a man whose talent had once lit up the screen. At the time of his death, he was supposed to star with Taylor in Reflections in a Golden Eye. The role was later given to Marlon Brando. Montgomery Clift's life was full of highs and lows. He was one of Hollywood's greatest actors, but his struggles with addiction and illness cut his career short. Even now, people remember him for his raw talent, emotional performances, and the tragic story of a star who burned out too soon.